Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our sold-out event, Environmental Racism, There's Something in the Water. My name is Evan Ferrari, and I'm the Executive Director at Emerge Guelph Sustainability. We're the hosts this evening, and I'm going to be your host for the evening as well. We have quite a lineup, including, of course, our keynote speaker. But before we go too far, what I would like to do is to introduce my colleague, Jaden Lasachuk. Jaden is our Communications and Outreach Coordinator, and she will be doing our Aboriginal land acknowledgement. Jaden, over to you.
Thank you, Evan. Hello, everyone. I'm speaking to you today from Guelph on behalf of Emerge, and so I'll be acknowledging the land that I am currently on. If you're in a different place, which I believe many of us are tonight, I encourage you to explore your relationship to the space that you're occupying on Turtle Island, the colonial history that has shaped that place, and what actions you can take in your community to uplift and empower the Indigenous peoples whom have cared for, tended for, and respected the land beneath your feet, the water in your place, and the air you have breathed since time immemorial. The city of Guelph resides on the lands of the Waldron peoples and the territories and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The city of Guelph is uniquely positioned on territories that are recognized within the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, which is an Indigenous citizenship law made between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations in around 1701, and it extends from Montreal to Fort Erie. It has three basic rules that I would encourage everyone to consider in their daily lives and actions. Take only what you need, leave some for everyone else, and keep it clean. Here at Emerge, the work that we do is to fight climate change, but we do it in a variety of ways, such as helping households in Guelph to lessen their impacts on the environment in an attempt to encourage families and households to keep it clean, whether that be through energy use or water usage. All the lands of Turtle Islands are steeped in rich Indigenous history, teachings, and truths from coast to coast to coast, and it is both our duty and our responsibility as settler Canadians to educate ourselves on the ongoing impacts of settler colonialism and colonial violence that are occurring every day. In Nova Scotia this week, for example, the Sibäganagati First Nation had one of their fishing boats burned overnight by non-Indigenous fishers in protest of this Mi'kmaq First Nation exercising their recognized treaty rights to a moderate livelihood through fishing. I would encourage everyone to take the time today and moving forward to learn about the history and current systemic issues that are impacting Indigenous peoples today, tomorrow, and every day until their treaty rights are respected and enforced. Thank you for the land acknowledgement and listening to that, everyone. And I'm very excited to now introduce Bruce Weaver, who will be speaking next. Bruce is a retired elementary school teacher. He has been in Guelph with his wife since 1983 and has been active in Indigenous circles since his discovery of his Native heritage around 10 years ago. He currently facilitates a men's circle, is a firekeeper for the community, and is a member of 7 Generations Forward, as well as working with the Guelph Public Library to develop stronger relations with the local Indigenous community. For the last 4 years, Bruce has facilitated the Kairos blanket exercise with local school boards, faith groups, and the University of Guelph and Ryerson University. Bruce is also an active member of Nature Guelph and a keen birder. Over to you, Bruce.
Thank you, Jaden. Good evening, everyone. I'll introduce myself in the traditional way. Pardon my accent. Deojena de Yangyats, Ganyankahaga, Niiok Waganyatan. So my Indigenous name roughly translates as His Bright Fire. Ganyankahaga is my nation. You know it as Mohawk. And my actual ancestors came from the Bay of Quinte area after being chased north since they sided with the British during the American Revolution. The final piece of that introduction identified me as being Turtle Clan. And Turtle Clans are the speakers for our community. So I take that role as well as firekeeping very seriously. Jayden, I'd like to thank you for your acknowledgement of the land and waters that we live on. I'm very pleased that you recognize the importance of the dish with one spoon. In our tradition, we say that originally that was a treaty, a covenant really, between us and the Creator. Later, we reaffirmed it with other nations who settled in these areas. And two pieces I'd like to point out about that dish with one spoon. It's a spoon because we don't want sharp objects when we are coming together. And a friend reminded me recently that that spoon is also a symbol for sharp words. We keep them out of our conversations. And so as we gather here tonight, we'll remember that we are speaking about issues that will affect the next 7 generations in all that we do. And I have virtual, well, this is not virtual, but for the rest of you, it's virtual Sema, our traditional tobacco, and I'll be holding it as I offer these words. As we listen tonight, may our ears hear the words spoken, but our hearts respond and our minds respond in a good way, that we seek action to follow these stories, that we may leave tonight in a good way. And we give thanks for the day that we have had, and we look forward to the speakers. May their words resonate deep in our hearts. Taima.
Thank you, Bruce. Really appreciate that. And on that note, I would like to just spend a couple of minutes putting context into what we're going to be talking about today, and that is environmental racism. We see racism as definitely being systemic in our society, and environmental racism is something that has existed in this country for hundreds of years. And unfortunately, we probably haven't seen the end of it yet. While our speaker this evening is looking specifically at Nova Scotia, she will also be touching on some high-profile issues here in Ontario as well, including the First Nation in Sarnia that many of you may know, that is essentially surrounded on 3 sides by the Chemical Valley in the Sarnia area. And of course, she'll also be touching on Grassy Narrows as well. Along with Queen from the Guelph Black Heritage Society, we looked at Guelph from the perspective of, and we spoke to a number of different people looking for an example of environmental racism in our community. And while there wasn't a direct comparison to what our main speaker will be talking about tonight, what we did find was that in the early 1900s, in the area that all of us know as the Lord, that Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and specifically non-English speaking white immigrants, tended to be pushed towards living closer to the smokestack industries of the foundries in what today is the ward rather. So while there could very well be good examples in the ward, in Guelph rather, we were unable to find anything that we could specifically point to. The fact that it wasn't blaring, it wasn't screaming in our face, could be that we're not looking in the right places, number one. But more importantly, when there is environmental racism anywhere in this country, we all need to do something about it. And I think the first step along that road is that we need to not only acknowledge it, but learn more about it. Needless to say, that concept has been around for quite some time. And on that note, I want to briefly also talk about our co-sponsors for the evening, and that is Ingrid's institution, Dalhousie University, a project that she will enrich you about, the Enrich project later on this evening, of course, the Guelph Black Heritage Society and Emerge. And I briefly want to talk to you about the work that we do in fighting climate change, and understanding that fighting climate change and fighting for environmental justice also means social justice. We can't have one without the other. Our approach to fighting climate change in Guelph has been to focus on a moniker of something positive, and in our sense, a community that achieves 100% renewable energy. Quick note about some upcoming events that we've got going on. The first one is Clearing the Air, How Clean Vehicles Improve Health and Save Lives. We're also going to release a report that we did in conjunction with the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute at the University of Guelph on attitudes about electric vehicles here in Guelph. And then we have two other events that I'm going to be a little coy with it, but I just want to give you a bit of a riddle. Two separate events, both are specific to climate change. One is something salty, and another thing is something spicy. And I'm just going to have to leave you with those two things to think about, and in the weeks to come, you're going to be hearing more about what those two events are actually about. To put climate change and to put the environment in Guelph into context, what we've been able to accomplish along with other collaborators here in Guelph is to get the community to agree to 100% renewable energy target by 2050 is the first goal. The second is a net zero carbon goal by 2050 for the entire city. And the city has indeed acknowledged a climate emergency. Many of us wanted that to be a declaration, but in fact, it's an acknowledgement, a somewhat softer announcement. Then briefly, from a next steps standpoint, we see that the city of Guelph must adopt yearly targets towards reaching that 100% renewable energy target, adopt yearly targets towards reaching that net zero carbon, and also accomplish these goals much sooner than 2050. We also want the city to demand positive climate action from the province in phasing out fossil fuel regarding the fossil fuel burning for electricity as well. So on that note, I am going to briefly, pardon me, I'm just going to stop my share here for a moment. And I want to do a quick introduction to our speaker this evening, Dr. Ingrid Waldron, from Dalhousie University. Ingrid is an associate professor in the Faculty of Health, director of the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities, and Community Health Project. That's the Enrich project, which she'll be speaking about later, and the flagship co-lead of the Improving the Health of People of African Descent. Her research, teaching, community leadership, and advocacy work are examining and addressing the health and mental health impacts of structural inequities within the environment, public infrastructure, health and mental health care, and child welfare in Black, Indigenous, immigrant, and refugee communities. As a director of the Enrich project over the last 8 years, Dr. Waldron has been investigating the socioeconomic, political, and health effects of environmental racism in Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian communities. The Enrich project formed the basis to Dr. Waldron's first book, There's Something in the Water. And by the way, you can't see it right here. It's also available through the Guelph Library. There's Something in the Water, Environmental Racism in Indigenous and Black Communities, which she received the 2020 Society for Socialist Studies Errol Sharp Book Prize and the 2019 Atlantic Book Award for Scholarly Writing. The 2020 Netflix documentary, There's Something in the Water, is based on Dr. Waldron's book and was co-produced by Waldron, actress Ellen Page, Ian Daniel, and Julia Sanderson, co-directed by Page and Daniel. Dr. Waldron is currently developed the first national anti-environmental racism coalition that will bring together partners from multiple sectors to address and advocate around environmental racism, climate change, health inequities, and other social inequities in Canada. And on that note, Ingrid, I'd like to hand the podium over to you.
Is that good? Can see it?
That's good.
Great. Thank you, Evan, and I would like to thank everybody for attending. I'm going to talk about some of the arguments that I made in the book and arguments that have driven the research that I've been doing through the Enrich project over the last 8 years. And right at the end, I'm going to discuss some of the ways that I've been addressing environmental racism. But before that, I'm also going to provide some case studies, examples of environmental racism in Ontario and in Nova Scotia. So when I was asked to write the book by Fernwood Publishing in 2015, I thought about what I wanted to write about, what I was seeing in the broader environmental justice movement in Nova Scotia and in Canada. And what I was seeing was an absence of race. A critical race analysis did not seem to be center in discussions on environmental justice. And as a race scholar, what I was seeing was that the communities that were most impacted were Indigenous and Black communities. So I was kind of questioning why race was not central. So I think I would say the first and the most important for me argument that I made in the book is that we needed to address the absence of race in the environmental justice movement. What I wanted to do then was to redefine the parameters of critique around that environmental justice discourse, because I felt that environmental issues, environmental justice issues were very much focused on issues related to conservation, wildlife protection, and sustainable development. And I'm certainly not saying that those are not important issues, but many of those issues, I felt that scholars were taking the politics out of those issues and that race was absent. So while once again, I believe that those are important issues, I felt that I can bring something different to the discourse, and race and racism was something that I wanted to bring to the discussion. Second, what I was also finding was that there was very little connection to health, to spiritual health, to psychological health, to physical health. And for me, environmental racism is essentially a health issue. There are a lot of environmental scientists who stop right there. They talk about pollutants and contaminants, but they never make the link to how it impacts people in terms of their health and well-being. But I was also seeing something else. I was seeing the psychological effects of environmental racism, the mental health impacts, and very few articles that I was reading or books were focusing on the mental health impacts. So as a health scholar, and as someone who sees the issue of environmental racism as, at its core, a health issue and a mental health issue, I wanted to provide a kind of holistic, intersectional understanding of health. I wanted to look at spiritual health, psychological health, mental health, and physical health in both communities. And I wanted to do it that way because certainly the Indigenous worldview is one that understands health as interconnected, but also an Afrocentric or an African-centered worldview is very similar. We also see the connection between the spiritual, the physical, the mental, similar to our Indigenous brothers and sisters. So I wanted to highlight that in the book. And finally, what I wanted to do was to provide a bit of a journey and to discuss the long history of struggle, grassroots mobilizing in both Indigenous and Black communities. While that may not be unique in and of itself, what I was finding was that there are books on Indigenous environmental issues and Indigenous mobilizing, and then there are books on Black issues, and I wasn't finding any you know, I couldn't find a book or articles that brought both communities together, particularly under the environmental racism topic. So I may be wrong, but I think my book is one of few, if any, book that brings together both communities and discusses the issue of environmental racism from the perspectives of both communities, and also talks about their struggles, the challenges that they've had, the mobilizing that they've been engaged in. What I didn't want to do is to pretend that I was coming in and doing something new. No, the work that I'm doing is building on the work that Indigenous communities and Black communities have been engaged in for decades. So I wanted to really highlight that in the book. So what is environmental racism? It's a question that I got asked a lot when I first started the project. People would approach me with a very quizzical look and ask me what it was because they had never heard of it. That was in Nova Scotia. And in 2013, I thought I would get to know the communities and drive down to the communities because I do community-based research. So I thought the first step was to get to know the communities. And I did a workshop in Lincolnville, which is an African Nova Scotian community that I'll talk about later, and met with James Desmond, who is a longtime environmental activist. And he provides a really fantastic quote, very simple, but actually in its simplicity, it captures all of the main components of environmental racism. So during that workshop that was filmed, and there's a film that you can find on those workshops on the Enrich website, he says the practice has been locating industrial waste sites next to African Nova Scotian Native and poor white communities that don't have a base to fight back. You ask if that's environmental racism, it's environmental racism to its core. So that packs a punch. What is he saying there? Well, he's talking about proximity. He's talking about the fact that there are certain communities that are proximate to waste sites and that are disproportionately impacted and exposed to toxins and pollutants. He's also highlighting the fact that those communities tend to be Black and Indigenous communities, but also poor white communities. So I always say that to people. It primarily impacts Black and Indigenous communities in North America, but there are white, low-income, poor communities, particularly those in rural areas in Nova Scotia, that are also impacted by environmental injustices. He also says it's communities that don't have a base to fight back. Well, he's essentially talking about communities that lack political and economic clout. Therefore, they tend to not be heard. These are certainly empowered communities, but because of the intersection of race, rural living, class, socioeconomic status, it's very difficult for them to be heard by government. So those intersections, the convergence of those issues for me makes it very hard for them to get action or to be heard on the issues. So it's a really fantastic quote from James Desmond, but I wanted to also provide you with the more academic quote from Bullard. I don't know if you heard about Dr. Robert Bullard, but he is considered to be the father of environmental racism in the United States. And he came out with a book in 1991 called Dumping in Dixie. And I would say he's one of the first scholars who started to conduct research in this area. So he says that it's about the disproportionate location and greater exposure of Indigenous communities and Black communities, racialized communities to pollution and contamination. In other words, there's a kind of spatial clustering of industry close to certain communities. He also said it's about the lack of political power that these communities have for resisting the placement of these sites. So similar to what James Desmond said, it's communities that lack political power, economic power to fight against the placement or siting of industries in their communities for the reasons I mentioned earlier. But it's also about policy. So when I talk about the spatial patterning of industry in these communities, that's the outcome. It's the outcome of environmental policies that allow, that sanction the placement of these harmful industries in these communities with life-threatening poisons, if we are to be honest, right? So environmental racism essentially is about environmental policies that are inscribed, I would say, with racist ideology, or racist ideology is written into environmental policy. And then what we see is the outcome, which is the clustering of waste sites in certain communities. He also says it's about the disproportionate negative impacts of environmental policies, resulting in differential rates of cleanup. So why do certain communities find it hard to get cleanup quickly and other communities don't? So we could talk about Pictou Landing First Nation, which I'll talk about later. Why did it take them since the mid-1980s when they started to complain about the issue, up until this year when the mill was finally closed? Why does it take some communities so long to get action from the government? Well, it's all the issues that I talked about before. It's all the It's about the disproportionate location. It's about the lack of political power, right? So all of these points are interconnected. And finally, one of the things that allows environmental racism to manifest and continue intergenerationally is the fact that the communities that are most impacted are never part of the solution, are never brought into organizations, whether they're ENGOs or NGOs or commissions and boards or the Department of Environment or regulatory bodies. They're the individuals who are impacted, but they tend to be excluded. So other individuals in these organizations are not benefiting from the perspectives, from the life experiences of communities that are impacted. So I think that's one of the reasons why environmental racism manifests over time, because we're not hearing from the people who are impacted. So I wanted to provide a few cases of environmental racism over the past several years, beginning with Nova Scotia. This is the community of Africville. And I always say that Africville is a symbol of both gentrification and urban renewal and environmental racism, right? This is a historical Black community that was pushed out of their neighborhood in and around 1965. The community was razed. There's actually a book called The Razing of Africville. Their church was actually burnt down. And we know how important the church is to people of the African diaspora around the world. So it was just pushing out of this community to make way for industrial development. Why is it? So that's a case of gentrification or urban renewal, but why is it also a case of environmental racism? Because what that development left in its wake were a number of environmental hazards, including a fertilizer plant, a slaughterhouse, a tar factory, a stone and coal crushing plant, a cotton factory, a prison, 3 systems of railway tracks, and an open dump. And while this is a historical case of environmental racism, the descendants of Africville would say that the traumatizing after effects of the razing of Africville is real, to the point where the community in 2016 tried to launch a class action lawsuit that was then thrown out in 2018. So this is an issue that still has psychological impacts for the descendants of Africville. Here's Lincolnville. I just showed you a picture of James Desmond, who provided a wonderful quote, a definition of environmental racism. This is his community. And this is a landfill. First and second generation landfill was placed in that community. The first generation landfill was placed in the community in 1974, and a second generation landfill in 2006. And like all the communities I'm going to discuss, this is a community that has seen increasing rates of cancer since that landfill was placed there. Here's Shelburne. Shelburne is another historic African Nova Scotian community, and while they don't have exact data or information, they believe that the landfill was placed in their community in and around 1943. And I met with a leader there in 2015, and they really mobilized, which I'll talk about later, but they got that landfill closed for the first time in 2016, but I'll talk about that a bit later. High rates of cancer. When I sat down with that leader, I was stunned. I thought she was lying to me, actually, when she sat in my office and she said, she had never heard of the term environmental racism. And she said, Ingrid, about 95% of the people in my community has cancer. Are you saying it's because of the landfill? And I said, well, I never say that, because I could never say that definitively, but I think that's very strange that you're telling me that basically almost everybody in your community, in the Black community, the south end of Shelburne, has cancer. So she still believes that. I never say definitively that that's the case to anybody, because I think you have to be careful. But there's certainly something going on. There's something in the water, as we say. Sabaganagati is an Indigenous community, and they have been fighting the development of a brine discharge pipeline in their community since around 2014. So it's development by Alton Gas of a brine discharge pipeline near the Shubenacadie River, which would allow natural gas to be stored in underground caverns near that river. And of course, concerns have been raised about the harmful impacts of that project on the community's health and well-being, and of course, fish as well. Here's Boat Harbour. I think this is perhaps the worst case of environmental racism was in Nova Scotia, perhaps second to Chemical Valley, but it's certainly one of the worst cases of environmental racism in Canada. That the mill that has been pumping effluent into Boat Harbour, it's been doing that since 1967. And the community has been speaking out about it since then, but specifically since the mid-1980s. And there have been a lot of broken promises by the government over the years saying, yes, we'll close it, and never came to pass. That is a community with extremely high rates of cancer, respiratory illnesses, reproductive health issues, kind of similar to Amjinwang First Nation. You probably already know that the mill was finally closed this year at the end of January. Here's Amjinwang First Nation, and as Evan mentioned earlier, a really significant, serious case of environmental racism that's long-standing as well. So this is a community that is surrounded by over 60 petrochemical facilities within a 25 square kilometer area. High rates of cancer, respiratory illness, reproductive illnesses, including birth anomalies, etc. And I'm familiar with a particular activist in that community, Vanessa Gray, who has been doing, very young, who's been doing extremely wonderful work in that community. And we also have Grassy Narrows First Nation. This is an Ojibwe reserve, and it's located north of Kenora, Ontario. And they've had concerns about the health impacts of contaminants from mercury that was dumped into the Wabigoon English River from Reed Paper's chemical plant in Dryden, Ontario in the 1960s and again in the 1970s. And in the community, this has resulted in mercury poisoning from fish. So these are just a few cases. Of course, we could talk about Wet'suwet'en, which is perhaps the most kind of recent. I mean, there are a lot of recent cases, but that's gotten a lot of attention in the media. So Wet'suwet'en in BC, and so many others. So in my book, certainly Nova Scotia is a bit of a case study, but in my book, I talk about environmental racism in Saskatchewan, Alberta, New Brunswick. So I focus on Canada in general. So I want to talk a little bit about community mobilizing and resistance, because one of the things I always want to do is highlight what these communities have been doing over the past several decades. And even though environmental racism is, I find it to be a very tough issue. It's a tough issue to address because you're fighting capitalism, you're fighting profit. I mean, there's profit is at the center of this issue. So I find because of that, it's extremely difficult to address it, but it's being addressed very slowly, and it may not be visible to everyone, but I have to point to the communities that I've gotten to know who I think have been doing a wonderful job. They're steadfast and they're determined, particularly the Indigenous community. I'm impressed with how steadfast they are and how determined they are and how energetic and how they use everything at their disposal, every method, every approach in order to address the issue. I want to start, yes, I'm going to talk about Lincolnville, the South End and Environmental Justice Society, which is in Shelburne. So these are the kind of NGOs that Lincolnville and Shelburne have formed to address the issue. I want to talk about Pictou Landing First Nation and Shubenacadie. So this is Lincolnville. And Lincolnville has engaged in protests and marches. I would say that has slowed down a bit over the years because they are tired. And Lincolnville is actually an elderly community, right? So they're elderly folks primarily. The young people out-migrated, partly because of the landfill, partly because of lack of jobs, of course. So you've got an elderly population that understandably is tired, unemployed. Of course, they're retired, and you know, many are engaged and active like James Desmond, but they also have other things going on in their community that makes it very difficult for them to continue to challenge this issue. They formed the Concerned Citizens of Lincolnville years ago as a way to voice their concerns about the landfill, the first generation landfill from 1974 and 2006. And that then they changed their name to the Lincolnville Reserve Land Council. So they've been engaged in kind of alternative methods. You know, I wouldn't say they're out protesting anymore, right? This picture that you see here is perhaps before I arrived in Halifax. There was a group of organizations and activists that were very engaged in the Lincolnville struggle. So that's probably a little bit before I came to Halifax, before 2008. But I wouldn't say that the community is active around protest, but they're kind of approaching the issue in a different way. They're now working with Eco-Justice, for example, which is a law charity across Canada. I became acquainted with them in 2016, and I said, you know, there's a community here called Lincolnville, and I'd like you to get to know them and to find out whether or not we can identify some legal remedies, whether it's a private prosecution or a class action lawsuit. I would like you to work with the community. So they have been working with the community. And as I'm going to talk about later on, we also did water testing because the community has said to us, we don't trust the government to test our water, right? They're going to say everything is okay, and we know it's not okay. So I formed, which I'll talk about later, I formed an NGO to test their water, which we did in 2016, and we were able for the first time to tell them what's in their water. When I talked earlier about the psychological impacts of environmental racism, you know, there's a fear and an anxiety about drinking water, which is one of the community members told me that, Mary Desmond. And she said, you know what, my husband died of cancer. And I know it's because he drank the water, and I refuse to drink the water. So she just drinks bottled water. But there's this kind of anxiety about drinking the water. So we were happy to actually do water testing, provide them with the results in a report, but also educate them on how to manage their drinking water supply. We talked about Shelburne earlier. She's in the film. If you saw the film, this is Louise DeLeo. She's very popular. When people tell me that they've seen the film, they seem to really love Louise. She is tough. And she's the one that I met in my office who said, Ingrid, everybody has cancer in my community. Is it because of the landfill? What she's done since I met her is astounding. This is a retired woman. She's not going to be angry with me if I tell you that she's around in her late 60s, had an activist life before, but was, you know, enjoying her life. And then in 2015, I said, I need to hire somebody from the community to do focus groups for me, because I don't want to do them because I do community-based research, and I want to find leaders who are respected to do that work. Instead of me coming into a community, nobody knows me, right? So let's find somebody who's respected. So I met with her in December of 2015, and I said, I'd really like you to take on this project. In 2016, she completed the focus groups, and the speed by which she has mobilized against this issue is shocking. From somebody who had never heard of environmental racism, and she sat in my office, to mobilizing her community. And that's what a focus group does, right? A focus group, you get people together and they start talking, they start becoming aware, they start getting angry, and then they start mobilizing. So she finished the focus groups in January of 2016, and a few months later, she had formed a non-charitable organization called the South End Environmental Injustice Society that is addressing not just environmental issues, but health issues and any social justice issue in her community. By November of 2016, she got that landfill closed. And that landfill had been open since 1943. This is all her work. Now, she has a team of people, yes, but she's the leader, and there's been some stunning achievements that she's been a part of since I met her. What you see here is Louise receiving the Nova Scotia Human Rights Award, which she received in December 2018 for the work that she and SEED have been doing around environmental injustices and other issues. here we have Pictou Landing First Nation, Boat Harbour. So they, I'm impressed with this community because they've done everything you can imagine. Road blockades, marches, letter writing campaigns, sit-ins in government offices, online petitions, setting up GoFundMe pages to raise funds for legal fees. They have a Facebook page called Stop Alton Gas, or the Treaty Truck House, the Treaty Truck House. But they also have the Treaty Truck House, which is an actual space in the community where they've engaged in education about colonialism, anti-colonialism, the Truth and Reconciliation Report. It's a space where allies and supporters and people who just want to get educated, young people, primarily students who are so engaged in this issue, go up and learn about these issues. So the Facebook page and the on-site Treaty Truck House have been so important in terms of getting their message out there, but also mobilizing the broader community in Halifax. So for me, it's a really important template or blueprint on how to do activism in that community. Sorry, I was just actually talking about this community. That's Alton Gas. Yeah, so let's talk about Pictou Landing First Nation. So Pictou Landing First Nation, as I mentioned, has been dealing with the mill since 1967. Their chief, Andrea Paul, similar to Sabaganagadi, which I just discussed, they've been also involved in road blockades, marches, etc. So it's the same type of activities. But as I said, they've been actually trying to address this issue since the mid-1980s. So over the years, they've tried everything. And in 2014, because Chief Andrea Paul felt that she and the community were not being heard, this is an example of a kind of a road blockade that they engaged in, but eventually that was halted when then Environment Minister Randy DeLaury promised that he would shut down the mill by 2020. He said, I promised that we're going to do it by 2020. And that happened, of course. So in December of 2019, and you'll see that in the film, Stephen McNeil from the Nova Scotia government said that the mill will be closed. He said he gave the mill enough time to develop a robust environmental assessment, and they failed. And he said, we failed this community over the past several decades, broken promises. He even used the term environmental racism, which is very interesting because that's a term that he was kind of staying away from over the past several years. And in the legislature one day, he used the term environmental racism, and Lenore Zan, the MP who developed the bill with me, said to him, she said, Stephen, you're actually using the term environmental racism. You're using it. So if you're using it, then you think it's real. And if you think it's real, why don't you stop it? I don't even know if he saw the film, but I find it extremely ironic that after my film came out in September 2019 at TIFF and the Atlantic Film Festival, all of a sudden he announced that this mill would close, and it's been open once again since 1967. So I don't know what we could attribute to that, but it's quite interesting. So this is a victory. This is an example of a victory for this community. The mill closed January 31st, 2020. So what have I been doing over the past, I guess it's 8 years? I see this as a community-based project. The Enrich project is community-based, it's interdisciplinary, it's multidisciplinary, it's collaborative, it's partnered, it is multi-sectoral, and it's multimedia. I want the Enrich project to be all of those things because I think there are different ways to tackle environmental racism, and even though some approaches might seem insignificant, I feel that engaging in multiple actions, multiple approaches simultaneously is the way to go. But it also keeps things interesting for me. And it also shares information with the broader community, because for me, if people don't know about this issue, they can't empathize with this issue. If they can't empathize with the issue, they're not going to act on it. So something like putting on an event like this, to me, is actually key, as much as legislation is key, because people get to know about the issue, and then perhaps they get incensed. You know, they get incensed. They're like, a lot of people say that to me, Ingrid, I can't believe this was in my backyard and I never knew about it. And then they get angry at themselves and they want to do something about it. So an event like this is actually key, and I've done a lot of that in Nova Scotia. So here's an example. In the woman standing up is Lenore Zan, actress. She was an actress, a movie actress, a stage actress, but was also an MP in Nova Scotia, an MLA in Nova Scotia, and she's now an MP, Liberal. She was an NDP MLA, now Liberal Party. And she's the one that I collaborated with on those environmental racism bills, which I'll talk about later. And you've got, you know, what I do with my events, of course, just like everybody does, you want different perspectives, right? I always have panels or events with both communities. And you don't really see that in Nova Scotia. It's interesting, you know, there are events for Indigenous people and there are events for Black people. And when I came to Halifax, I said, you know what? I said very naively, I said, I'm going to bring these two communities together. Yes, they have distinct histories, but they have a lot in common. And I made a commitment to myself that I would bring them together. And I do that with every single event. But beyond that, I also want people with different perspectives. So Lenore is a government person. You've got Doreen Bernard from Sabaganaganey First Nation in the black sitting down there. Next to her is Caroline. I forgot her name, but she's a government person. In the blue in the middle, you've got Mary Desmond from Lincolnville. And then in the green, you've got Lynn Jones. She is the sister of Rocky Jones, who was a civil rights activist in Nova Scotia and was friends with people from the Black Panther movement. So she's got activism in her blood. And this was a very interesting event that I held in 2015. So I've continued to do events. And I find that when I do these events, I get more people who want to volunteer, because they sit in the audience and they're like, wow, I didn't know about this. And then they approach me and they say, I want to volunteer. So when I don't have funding, which is often, sometimes I don't have funding, I have volunteers to help. This is my book. Of course, I'm an academic, so I have to write, I have to publish, not just because my job depends on it, but because I'm not going to be taken seriously if I don't. One of the first meetings I had with government, Nova Scotia Environment, at the end of 2014, I met with some policy people and they said, Ingrid, where's your data? Where's your evidence? You say that there are health impacts. You say that these people have cancer. Where's your evidence? At that point, I didn't have a book. I had just started. But I wanted this book to be about evidence or data, but I also wanted to make the arguments I mentioned earlier. And I also wanted to kind of silence the naysayers, the people who said to me, there's no environmental racism, Ingrid. Why are you making a big deal of this? Why are you making it into race? It's a class issue, Ingrid. So I kind of reflected on all the kind of critiques that I received over the years and doubt from people. And I said, I'm going to pack all of that into this book. But it also provides data on the environmental health impacts on mobilizing over the years from the perspectives, once again, of both communities, not one community. I mentioned earlier that I founded an NGO because I felt that the political kind of activism that I do with the Enrich Project is important, but I also needed to provide the communities with a win. And that's actually what a geologist said to me after the event that I just showed you. There was a geologist I had never met at that point in the audience of this event. And he said, Ingrid, I attended your event last night. I would like to meet with you. And the thing with me is I meet with everybody. That's why I think the project has continued on, because I'm always open to meeting with people, because they can take me down a different path. I can get stuck in my way, right? So when you meet people, you open yourself up to possibility. So he's a geologist, a hydrogeologist. He said, attended your event last night, would like to meet you. I met with him. He was extremely critical. everybody was emailing me, Ingrid, your event, it was so great, it was so entertaining, you had drummers, and he was like, yeah, it was good. And I said, good? He said it was good, but what are you giving to these communities in a concrete way? The legislation is good, Ingrid, the event is great, but what are you giving to these communities? What's the win? And I said, I don't know what you mean. He said, you need to give them a win. Why don't we think about testing their water? And I thought, well, yeah, but I said, I'm not an environmental scientist. I can't do that. So who's going to do it? He said, I do it. I'm a hydrogeologist. So why don't we form a working group with members of the Enrichment Project, and we look at testing water at no cost because these communities can't afford it. And of course, the government in Nova Scotia would say, and it is a fact, that homeowners are responsible for testing their own water. It's not what they do. So why don't we do a historical profile on these communities? Why don't we test their water? And why don't we document it in a report and then give it to them and then go back to the community, sit with them and do workshops and share information on the health impacts of pollutants in their water, answer any questions they have, and also show them how to, or educate them about how to manage their drinking water supply. So that, we did that in Lincolnville in 2016, and we thought this worked well. This is a great blueprint. Why don't we form an NGO to just do this? So in the spring of 2017, we formed the NGO Rural Water Watch. And the mission is to test water in rural, marginalized communities in Nova Scotia, go into the communities, test their water at no cost, show them how to test their own water, which is capacity building, and also do well water workshops. A lot of, as you know, rural residents tend to be on well water, and well water tends to be more contaminated. But a lot of these communities have cracked wells, right? They're not aware necessarily that this is potentially risky. So our job is to go into the communities and also talk to them about their wells and to talk about what is required to maintain a healthy well. Because a healthy well means that, or an unhealthy well is a risk to your health. So we've also been doing that with various communities. And on October 18th, we are having an event, an online event and an in-person event around healthy wells. Using social media, we're going to be sharing information, but we are also going into the communities and we're taking samples of their water. So it's kind of a layered event that we're doing that's online with a live Facebook event, live piece of it with a professor who's an expert in this area, but also going to the communities, and we're taking all the proper protocols around COVID and getting samples from them. So this NGO is extremely exciting to me because I think back to 2015 when the geologist was very critical and he said, when are you going to give them a win? And we're giving them a win now. So I feel really good about this. Eco-Justice, as I mentioned earlier, had been working with Lincolnville, but they were in other parts of Canada and they only opened up their office in 2018, the spring of 2018 in Nova Scotia. So as soon as I heard that they had opened up an office, I marched right down there and I met with the two lawyers and I said, well, let me tell you about the communities here. You already know about Lincolnville because you were working with them, but you need to know about Pictou Landing First Nation. You need to know about Sabaganagadie First Nation, and you need to know about Shelburne. These are communities I've been working with, and it would be great if you could work with them. They were already on it. You know, they were already working with Pictou Landing First Nation, but he had never heard of the African Nova Scotian community of Shelburne. So since 2018, they've been working with all those communities to look at legal remedies to address environmental injustices in their communities. I'm also working with Let's Sprout, an NGO, two young women who are graduates of Dalhousie's sustainability program. And they were also in an audience, one of the events I held. And the co-director approached me and she said, I would like to work with you one day, Dr. Waldron. I hope that can happen. And it did. About a year later, she said that she would like to involve me in the capstone course at Dalhousie, which involved about 6 students working with a client to address an issue. And And we decided that we wanted to tackle the education system, right? Because we felt that the high school and middle school curricula in Canada, but also in Nova Scotia, they were not dealing with environmental racism issues. Sustainability perhaps, but I don't see sustainability as environmental racism. I think once again, it takes the politics out of the issue because it's not talking about colonialism, it's not talking about racism. So we actually did an environmental scan of the high school and middle school curricula in Nova Scotia and found, yes, this topic is absent. So how do we tackle that? The first step for us is to develop tools, creative online tools that teachers can use in the classroom to teach about environmental racism. Which types of tools? Well, creative tools, music, social media, storytelling, essays, short stories, graphic art, poetry. These are some of the best ways to engage young people. So how do we take those creative approaches and create some tools that we would provide to teachers to teach the histories of Mi'kmaq peoples, the history of Black peoples, and environmental racism. COVID stopped us in our tracks. We should be farther along than we are. We did hold a workshop last year in October, and the objective is to provide the Indigenous community and the Black communities with the tools to hold a similar workshop that they would lead. I think we still want to go ahead and do it, perhaps on Zoom. But yes, we've been stopped in our tracks. The long-term goal of this, I mean, there's the issue of the tools, the creative tools, but the long-term goal is actually to transform the high school and middle school curricula. That's very difficult. We know that's an uphill battle, but that's our long-term goal. We also want to make teachers more comfortable teaching about racism because in Canada in general and in Nova Scotia, teachers they're mostly white, right? In the school system, the teachers are white. And they're worried, they're scared, they're anxious. White teachers tend to be anxious. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't think I could talk about racism. I don't know enough about it. I might trip up. I may sound stupid. I might insult somebody. So there's real legitimate, which I understand, there's a legitimate fear about talking about racism. So part of our project is also about how do we get teachers, primarily white teachers, to be more comfortable? Because if you don't do that, then none of this matters. Like creating this program doesn't matter if the teachers are going to say, you know what, I'm not doing this. I'm not going to be called out by Black students because I was talking about African Nova Scotians and I said the wrong thing, right? So I think that's an important part of the equation. I'm very excited about my collaboration with Climate Action Services. I have to say that I haven't been engaged enough in climate change because it was kind of over there. I didn't have any expertise. I didn't have any knowledge. I'm not a climate scientist. I have to admit that I was a bit afraid that I would trip up. But then I said to myself, I can approach this from a different angle, from that climate justice approach that I keep hearing everybody talking about. What is it? You know, and I was forced to learn about climate justice at an event that I participated in with the great David Suzuki last year in July when he came to Halifax. And we had a kind of climate justice event, huge. And I said, you know what, it's time for me to learn more about this. And I thought, well, the climate justice approach, yeah, since I'm already focusing on racism with the environmental topic, let me focus on that again. Let me look at how racialized women and women in developing countries are more impacted by climate change impacts or have a unique and specific experience of that. And I thought, yeah, I have something to bring to this. Although I don't have the language, I will never pretend to have the language of a climate scientist, I can bring something to this. So I did actually start collaborating last year with Climate Action Services. These are retired environmental professionals. This is before COVID. They came to me and they said, we want to do some workshops in the African Nova Scotian community. I said, this is perfect because it's a community that I feel is not engaged enough in climate change. It's almost like if this is not our issue, right? And it is everybody's issue, but I also want them to know, African Nova Scotians, that you might be impacted in a very specific and unique way because you already experience other vulnerabilities. So climate change impacts could compromise you in a way that it doesn't compromise other people. So we are currently planning climate change workshops in Shelburne and in 3 other Black communities in Nova Scotia. 2 workshops in each community. The first one to educate, the second one to talk about climate change adaptation, providing people with the tools. And I said to the climate scientists who are doing this with me, I said, you can't use the typical language, greenhouse gas emissions and what, you can't, don't do that. Because that just, people don't engage with that language. What you need to do is you need to show people that there's a social, political, economic, and health impact of climate change and how it impacts them specifically. That person, that person's family, and that person's community. If you bring it down a little bit and you personalize it, the African Nova Scotian community would be more engaged. So that's what we're trying to do. Training is part of what I do. I train students from all disciplines of Dalhousie. I find that environmental racism is that topic that engages law students, sociology students, environmental science students, health students, planning students, geography students. Believe it or not, like I've been able to engage students in all of those disciplines because environmental racism centers on all of those issues. It's a planning issue. It's a health issue. It's an environmental science issue. It's a geography issue. It's a law issue, right? So it's been so exciting for me to be able to work with students from different disciplines and provide them with opportunities to actually work with communities. And then media has been important. I've done tons of television interviews, podcasts, radio interviews. This is knowledge mobilizing. This is how you share knowledge to different audiences. How do you target different people to create awareness? So that's ongoing work for me to engage with the media and raise awareness about this issue. Ellen Page, Ellen Page reached out to me on Twitter. I was shocked in late 2018. She was following my page unbeknownst to me and started promoting my book and my project and the women. And then we connected on the phone in late 2018, the week before Christmas, and then again in January 2019. And eventually we decided that a film would be the ideal way to share knowledge. So this has been extremely exciting for me, as you can imagine. Our film made it to TIFF, which was huge. We actually submitted it after the deadline, but she's Ellen Page, right? So we got in. And then we screened it at the Atlantic Film Festival, the Halifax Black Film Festival, a film festival in Peterborough, North Bay Film Festival, the Windsor International Film Festival. It was a really great ride. And this is all of us on the red carpet, and promoting the film. It then made it to Netflix. I knew about that, when I went to TIFF. I knew that it was going to Netflix. I didn't think it was a reality, but they mentioned that it probably would. And it started streaming on Netflix March of this year. And that has been extremely exciting because, of course, Netflix is global. So what better way to share information and to inspire people than this global platform? I mean, I've received a lot of emails, comments from people about the film and how inspiring the women in the film are, which warms my heart, because when journalists ask me, what do you want to come out of this film? What do you want to see happen? And I always said, well, I want to share knowledge, I want to raise awareness, but I really want to inspire people. I want young Indigenous girls, young Black girls, young racialized girls, and young girls of any race to look at the women in the film and say, maybe I can do that too. These are not women with economic power or political power. They're women in their communities, but this work that they've been doing is so powerful. And boy, I would love young girls of any race, but particularly Black and Indigenous women, because they're often discounted, to look at that and say, wow, maybe I can do something like that. I love art, as you know, and creative things and film, and I'm currently organizing something for the Nocturne Annual Art Festival here in Halifax. It's going to be on Zoom, and I'm bringing together the folks from the communities I just discussed, and who were featured in the film, with artists, with performers, with poets, with dancers, with singers to share stories of environmental racism in their community. This is October 14th, next week at 7 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time. And you can find more information on the Facebook page for this, or you can email me. It's going to be interesting. I hope it goes well. Some of it is live and some of it is pre-recorded, but this is for me another way to share information. Not everybody wants to read my book, you know? Some people want to receive information about environmental racism in different ways, right? So it's kind of my ongoing kind of project to share in creative ways. And then I mentioned Lenore Zan earlier. She was the woman who was standing up. She and I developed the bills I mentioned, but this is the most recent bill, the federal bill, Bill C-230. Was introduced end of February this year, and she's hoping to put it forward either this fall or next year. So that's a federal bill, that would a federal environmental racism bill, of course, for all of Canada. I recently started a new coalition with Naolo Charles from Toronto, and we are starting a brand new anti-environmental racism national coalition. We already have partners. We look at environmental racism broadly, so we are going to also include climate change, health inequities, criminal justice. Like for us, it's grounded in environmental racism, but we also want to look at other inequities. So we just started this coalition. We're building it right now. We're kind of figuring out the objectives. We already have about 10 partners from across Canada, and I'm really excited about this. And finally, I just recently joined another network. This is about the right to a healthy environment, which we have yet to secure in Canada, shockingly. So it was formed by somebody who used to work for the Blue Dot Foundation at the David Suzuki Foundation. And we are looking to secure the legal right to a healthy environment in Canada, and to incorporate human rights into that. And to establish accessible and practical legal tools. So we just met for the first time about a week ago, and one of the first actions that we're thinking about is writing a letter to Justin Trudeau about the fact that he's known about this, that he's been sitting on this for years, and that we're still kind of working out that letter. But it needs to be different because he's received a lot of letters, I would think, about this particular issue. We're coming at it from a different approach. We want people who are not necessarily engaged in environmental issues. We want human rights organizations. We want women's organizations. We want health organizations. We're actually trying to target people who are not in the environmental stream, right? So that Justin Trudeau can see that all these different people from different types of organizations are coming together to ask for the right to a healthy environment. So this is the newest project that I'm engaged in. And I'm going to close right now. I'd really like to thank you for listening. And I guess we'll take it back to Evan.
Well, actually, I am Rasha. I will be handing over. Yeah, thank you, Ingrid. This is very inspiring to us. You enriched us with a lot of information about community mobilization and engagement. I found this interesting to talk about how you managed to form an NGO for the Rural Water Watch to test the water. In fact, this is very changing point and winning point for the fight against environmental racism. Thank you, Ingrid. What a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you.
So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Queen for this evening. Queen is the executive director of Guelph Black Heritage Society. She grew up in Guelph, attending the University of Guelph. She then migrated to Toronto, graduating as valedictorian from the Randolph Academy for the Performing Arts. Queen advocates for the rights of African and Caribbean people within the Black, Indigenous, and person of color community in Guelph. And she works closely on anti-racism training, social justice, and policy change. Last June, she led the local movement of Guelph's Black Lives Matter protest, and she used her platform to educate her community and elected officials. Queen is dedicated to Carnival, helping promote Black excellence through Caribana, while giving her time back to high school during Black History Month. Besides being a cannabis educator and activist, Queen runs two businesses, the Heels Academy and the Queen Company. Queen is a dance teacher, giving soca, dance hall, and Afro classes at the University of Guelph. She's honored to hold an artistic residency for the years 2020 and 2021 with Guelph Dance as a result of her creative ideas for the Black community through dance. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Queen. Queen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you for such a great introduction. And truly, it's just such an honor to be here with people I have admired for such a long time. Bruce, you do just such brilliant work with our Indigenous communities, and I'm so honored to have been connected with you this year. And same, Ingrid, thank you for just so much education. As you notice, I work heavily within the Black communities, but in a different space that doesn't necessarily put me heavily in the environmental racism work. So this has been a joy to be educated as much. I know we see some of the comments on the side, it's overwhelmingly inspiring, like in that such a good way to say it, Dan. So thank you for that comment. You know, I would just like to chat with both of you, Bruce and Ingrid, on more that we can do, other things that we can do for our communities. We are seeing a lot of changes that have been happening. You talked about these bills. We've seen BZ Gray from the Grassy Narrows area making, you know, a big move by trying to sue the Doug Ford government on the weakening of our 2020 climate change and our targets. And we're seeing that people are trying to push money into the communities for all that has been done. The $9 million in compensation that was thrown at the First Nations community in the Grassy Narrows. But, you know, for both of you, maybe Bruce, you want to speak on this first and then Ingrid next, is there really enough money to compensate for the trials we've experienced for hundreds of years and now leading up to this moment where we're really just seeing an active change from community leaders?
Well, the short answer is no. The issues for me are how do we get heard? And I know you and Ingrid are activists. My activist days are over. I'm of an age where I like to try to find back channels, back doors to people who can be heard. And I wonder if you'd like to speak a bit to that as well, somewhere in this conversation. But Ingrid, maybe you'd like to speak about the money issue.
Well, just to your point on being heard, I think you have to find champions. I think everything that community members have been doing and people have been doing around environmental injustices, they're on target. That's what we need to continue to do. We need to engage in civil disobedience and marches and rallies. That's really important because it brings attention to the issue. But, you know, as I always say, demands from the streets mean nothing if they're not translated into policies. So we need to have environmental legislation. For me, that's the key. But it's also important to have champions. You can have environmental legislation and policy, but if the people in that particular organization are really not committed and they're just going through the motions, then it means nothing. And I feel for me, that champion is Lenore Zan. She's actually been the only person since I've been doing this project who's kind of stepped up and has continued. You know, we met in 2015 and now she's come to me this year with a federal bill. She's never given up. So I think you have to, and the people who are in power, of course, are typically white people. You've got to find those white people, everybody, but white people who are typically in power, who are champions and who want to work with you and who really care about the issue. I also think it's important to, I think the root cause of it is that, well, the real challenging issue, of course, is, as I said, profit. Like, how do you address this issue when government makes money off of this? That's what's really difficult. So money is more important than the health and well-being of communities, and that's just a reality of it. So that's why I think it's an extremely tough issue. But when I think of a community like Pictou Landing First Nation that did experience victory after a long time, I feel that all the work that they've been doing led to that. And it did take a long time. And I think this issue is going to take a long time for a lot of communities, but I have been seeing progress. So I think that everything that is being done must be done, needs to continue to be done. We need to keep on, we need to sustain it. Often I feel that people in Nova Scotia, they get tired, and that's the reality. You get tired, but we've got to keep it up. We've got to keep the mobilizing up. If Lenora Zan puts this bill to second reading, she needs to see that people are mobilized around it. She needs to have people write to politicians. She needs to have petition signing. She wants to see people active around it. But if we're not, then there's no reason for the government to do anything. So I think with this particular issue, we get fed up and we get tired, but we need to continue to do what we've been doing. The root of it for me too is education. It seems pretty benign, but the people in power right now, who will be out of power in the next few years or the next decade, did not have the advantage of the education that some of the young people that I'm connected with have. So when I talked earlier about the educational system and the curricula in Nova Scotia needing to change and needing to educate people in a different way, that's really actually crucial, one of the most important points, because those children, those high school and middle school children are our future leaders. So providing them with the right intellectual tools, a different way of thinking is to me the key, because they're the future leaders who will then be taking up positions in Nova Scotia environment. The individuals right now in Nova Scotia environment, many of them are not environmental experts. They're not environmental scientists. They go from different government departments to different government departments and don't necessarily have expertise in the environment. So for me, providing students, our future leaders, with the critical tools to understand these issues, so that when they become leaders, they start to make the right decision. I feel that that's crucial. I think that's getting at the root of this problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you make such a valuable point, is getting down to that education piece. We talk a lot about that here in Ontario, but especially in Guelph, is how do we change that educational component? How do we, change the stories that were originally written by the victors? And unfortunately, those victors have destroyed a lot of our history. And what I really, truly appreciated was something that you had mentioned about, if there's no money, there's volunteers. And that really sat with me. And you're right, because Louise and Michelle, after, I'm not sure how many people on this chat have seen the documentary, but Louise and Michelle are incredibly moving people. And having a face that you connect with, that you feel for, watching the tears coming down Michelle's face as she talks about her grandfather in the whole transition of what happened in Boat Harbour is really what connects me. And I think, that point that needs to be said is that it takes the volunteers, it takes those little steps along the way, it takes the closed door advocacy to really make that happen. I do have a question here regarding sustainable energy. So sustaining the energy in the long run by sharing tasks amongst multiple community stakeholders and organizations. So are there any tips for motivating organizations to start mobilizing and working together? I think that's a really good question, because you've talked about some of these AGOs. Even just the connection we have right here is a really good representation on that. Maybe Ingrid, you'd like to start, and Bruce, off to you.
I think the problem is a lot of professionals are in silos. And when I look at environmental racism, as I said, it's a sociological issue. It's an environmental science issue. It's a planning issue. It's a health issue. It's a legal issue. It's all of those things. And typically, people in the environmental movement, not in every case, are working in silos. And what the Enrich project has shown me is that when you bring people from different professions together, wow, right? I never thought I'd be working with a hydrogeologist,
Yeah.
And he actually contributed to one of the most important initiatives, which is the NGO, because now we're able to, for the first time, test people's water. So I've always been, throughout this project, I've been open to anyone and everyone approaching me, because I know that the answer, the solution, is in multi-sectoral and interdisciplinary partnerships. but it's really important for other people to see that. So in some cases with environmental scientists, I would say to them, because they stop at the science, and I say, you do know that this is a health issue, right? So if you're going to post that information on Facebook, can you also post something about the health impacts of the well being cracked? Because I find that typically the environmental scientists that I know, there's no connection to health and well-being. There's no connection to community or mobilizing.
The intersectional,
the context. I talk about this in my book, that if you're an environmental scientist simply focused on pollutants, you're missing the whole story. You need to have the context. You need to understand that community in the context, right, of what you're focusing on and the pollutants. And how does the pollutant connect to the history of that community? How does it connect to other vulnerabilities that that community is experiencing, like food security, like housing insecurity, like structural racism in all our social structures? So for me, I would like to see people have an expanded lens. And I know there's anxiety around that, because they would say, I'm not a sociologist. Why are you asking me to understand that? But I'm not an environmental scientist. You know, I was terrified. But what is a partnership? Partnerships are about addressing the gaps, what you don't know. You have to be honest and say, you know what, I don't know that. You know, I have to be honest and say, you know what, I don't know it. I have to be honest with myself. And how do I address the fact that I don't know? Well, I'm going to bring in people who do know. And I think for some people, it's like they don't want to admit that they don't know. So if you are missing the part about colonialism, bring in an environmental sociologist. You know, if you're missing the part about planning, bring in a planner. That's what I do. So.
And maybe Bruce, you can speak to that too. You know, you say you're not really in the activism space anymore, but truly it's because of you that we have so much voice here. You're the first person I want to reach out to when it comes to these. How would you say, or what would you say to our youth and our next leaders on how to start working together more?
I'd say look at 10C right here.
Yes.
It's because this is a hub. It brings so many different community organizations together. And I find, I like the term cross-pollination, that we take a little bit here, go over there and add a thought or two. And those building connections, building really strong networks, and Guelph is really good at it. I think people like Sally Ludwig, who's worked so hard in the community to bring those bridges, build bridges. Your work. There's just so many examples I can think of. The Guelph Museum has pulled together a diverse group. Indigenous and Black history has been highlighted there. And so we're bringing in the education pieces, we're bringing in community organizations that can build. And I think many of us are getting into the schools more and more. And as we get into the schools, we can say those things about this community. And I want to give a shout out to Barb Burnett. The bookshelf has been a hub. Isn't that a great place where ideas are shared? We bring in speakers. She's gifted space and time to the Indigenous community. Those are valuable things for us, and we need to use them well and be wise about how we use our volunteers. I'd say that as well.
Amazing. I know we have another question up on deck, and I'd like to bring it right back to one of the men leaving the space for us to chat is Evan. And, you know, I want to open the floor up to you for your question and, yeah, discuss on some of the other things that are going on with you.
Thanks, Queen. Ingrid, just specifically about the private members bill, that's really quite exciting. And I remember having that conversation with you before. But a couple of parts to the question. First off, is it a private members bill? And if it is, are there any other potential MPs to co-sponsor the bill? Because I know that generally private members bills, even if they are from a member within the, the governing party of the day, they usually, with very few exceptions, they actually get passed. So I'm curious what outreach to other MPs has happened to date. And then I got a follow-up question for that.
Yes, you're right. It is a private member's bill, and you're right. They typically don't pass. So the one that was developed in 2015 and 2018, we introduced it, and Lenore introduced it, and it went to second reading, but it never went further than that. The next stage would have been law amendments. So, and when I met with Lenore in 2015, she said, Ingrid, these bills don't pass, so don't get your hopes up. She said, but they're very good for creating, she said, we can do a media event, and we did that. She said, we can get into newspapers, we can raise more awareness about environmental racism, we'll do a big media launch, and all of that did happen. And I would say in Nova Scotia, people are, kind of aware about environmental racism, so it's good for that. So this bill is a private member's bill, but Lenore sought out support from a few people. So she got support from Elizabeth May, who's the former Green Party leader. She has support from David Suzuki. He actually wrote an article about a month ago telling everybody to support this bill. And she also sought out support from an Indigenous woman. I forgot who she is, but she's she's in the House of Commons and she's from Manitoba. And because she asked me, she said, and there's of course Wanda Bernard Thomas, the African Nova Scotian senator. And I think she asked me, should I seek out support from Wanda or this Indigenous woman? I think, yeah. And I said, I think the Indigenous woman, because it's a federal bill. And we see cases of environmental racism in Indigenous communities across the country. And I think if you can get support from an Indigenous woman, that's ideal. So far she's gotten support from those three individuals, maybe more, but I haven't spoken to her in probably about 2 months. But
That have been Nikki Ashton. Sorry, would that have been Nikki Ashton?
I don't remember the name.
NDP?
I think it would be Liberal.
Okay.
I think.
Now there's, Northern. Okay.
Maybe.
Ingrid, I have a follow-up to that, and it's a follow-up question to Queen. But what it sounds like is that you need all the support you can get with MPs across the country. Queen, is it time for us to go and see Lloyd Longfield and maybe have another conversation with Ingrid and with the sponsor of the bill? I'm afraid I don't remember the name, Ingrid, and that I'm sure another ally of another liberal. I mean, he is a Liberal MP. Not that it would be better to have allies from all the different parties. But Queen, I just throw that out to you as a question, and I'll go back on mute now.
I think absolutely. I think if anything, these are the times that we put the pressure on our MPs, especially ones who sit with the Black Caucus like Lloyd Longfield does and has been doing. I do want to recognize that he has been doing such great work, trying to take away the racialized carding and what, Mike has been doing with his office as well. I think this is the time that we keep making these connections so that we can give more voice to our communities. Only building on that voice is going to make us better as the Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. So I say, hell yes to that. So I'm always about putting pressure on our MPs. But you know what I say to our community too is we expect that pressure from you two as well, as much as we put on ourselves to do the work, the hard work, have the hard, tough conversations with your family and your friends. I know I took a lot of notes on things that I got to learn from Bruce and Ingrid today. And those are things that we can take back within our own areas of work. Where do you work right now? Are these discussions happening at your family table? Are these discussions happening for you on the social media platform? Are we extending that out to our MPs, to our mayor, to our city councilors? There are just so many, small tangible ways that we can really make a difference. And I do want to thank Ingrid and Bruce for all the, let's say, tireless work that you and other activists like myself have been doing within this community. That is such a great way to put it, is tireless, but passionate. A lot of passion, and that's what keeps us, that's what keeps going is, the passion and the Louises and the Michelles and these people that we hear their story and we can either relate to or just want to amplify. So thank you so much. And a big thank you to Emerge, 10C, Guelph Black Heritage Society, and Dalhousie University. So thank you, Jaden, I'll pass this back to you, but thank you everyone for coming out today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Queen, for starting off that. Thank you. I wholeheartedly agree with everything that you said. I just want to extend deepest gratitude for the three of you tonight, Bruce, Queen, and Ingrid, for speaking with us. Bruce, I wanted to thank you so much for highlighting the positive cross-sectoral approaches and coalitions that are happening in Guelph and the important work that people have been putting in, and just how enlightening those partnerships are in our community and those networks that are being created. Queen, you did a wonderful job tonight, and we're so thankful for you for shining a light and opening the conversation on what we can do moving forward and how we can encourage ourselves and the folks around us to have these conversations on environmental racism and on systemic issues that are facing our communities, and how we can talk to our families about them and utilize social media. I think that that's a really big key takeaway that we're gonna have from this. So thank you for that. And finally, Ingrid, thank you for taking the time to come and speak with us about your incredibly important work in Nova Scotia and across Canada now with the academic contributions that you are making through Dalhousie University. As someone in academia, I'm in my master's degree right now at the University of Guelph, actually studying climate justice. So I was really happy when you brought up the topic of climate justice. I'm currently in the middle of collecting my data and analyzing that. So when you spoke about needing the data to back up what you're saying and talking about that, that hit really close to home for me right now. So I was quite happy for you to talk about that. And I'm from a rural community in Manitoba. And so we have a lot of issues with our water as well. So knowing about the rural water watch is something that is now really important to me. And something that I'm going to be looking into, and I hope that the other folks in attendance tonight do as well. And we just want to conclude by just again extending our deepest gratitude and saying how lucky we all have been to learn from the three of you tonight, and just what a wonderful experience this has been. We are very grateful, and we hope that you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Jaden.
Thank you so much.